Rain pelted the ragged roof of the saloon like the devil's own knuckles, loud and unrelenting. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of spilled whiskey and wet horses. In the farthest corner, hunched beneath a battered hat, sat a man who hadn't smiled in years. Clay Maddox, 32 years old and already worn thin as a snake-bit fence post. Once a proud cowboy, he now drifted from ranch to ranch, shoveling manure and breaking bones for pennies. He was the kind of man people looked through, not at. The world had moved on. It didn't need cowboys anymore. He swirled the dregs of his drink and stared into the cracked mirror behind the bar. A stranger stared back, hollow eyes, stubble like dry grass, shoulders slumped under the weight of too many years lived hard. Outside, the thunder cracked like a rifle shot. Inside, the piano had long gone silent. Then the saloon doors swung open with a creak and a gust of wind. In stepped a woman wrapped in midnight blue velvet, her silver hair pinned up like royalty and eyes sharp as frostbite. Everyone turned. Nobody blinked. They all knew who she was. Margaret Everly. She was a legend in this corner of Wyoming, a widow of 4 husbands, each of whom left her wealthier than the last. She was 71 years old and owned half the territory, including 2 mines, 3 ranches, and the rail spur that sliced through the mountains. They called her the Ice Duchess. Some said she'd buried each husband with her own hands. Others swore she never even cried at their funerals. Clay didn't look up. He didn't have to. He felt her presence like a chill sliding down his spine. She walked past the gawkers, past the drunks, and stopped in front of him. Her voice, when it came, was low and controlled, like someone who didn't waste breath. "You're the one they call Maddox." Clay slowly lifted his eyes. "Who's asking?" "I've got a proposition." He almost laughed. "Lady, I ain't in the market for trouble tonight." She smiled barely. "You look like a man who's already drowning." "I'm offering a rope." The next hour passed in a haze. They sat in the back room. She laid it all out, no pretense, no flirtation, no mask. She wanted to marry him. In return, she'd make him rich. Not rich like a new pair of boots. Rich like land, title, freedom. All she asked was 7 days. Appearances, she said. For the sake of legal documents, inheritance, control over her asset. She needed a man, temporarily. No love, no expectations. Just play the part. Clay looked at her for a long time. He thought about his father dying with a debt collector at the door. He thought about the fire that took his sister's cabin. He thought about eating squirrel stew for 3 winters straight. He said yes. They married the next morning in a quiet ceremony under gray skies. She wore black lace, he wore his best shirt, the one without holes. The preacher didn't ask questions, and no one from town dared interrupt. The moment the vows were said, Margaret handed Clay a deed. 80 acres of good land, just east of Devil's Ridge. A clean slate. At the ranch house she gave him a room of his own, a stable for his horse, and an unspoken rule: don't ask what you're not willing to bury. Clay tried to convince himself he didn't care. He took the land, worked it, rode out at sunrise, returned at dusk. She didn't need company, and he didn't offer it. But every now and then, in the deep hours of night, he heard her playing the piano through the old stone walls, haunting, beautiful pieces that didn't belong in a life this hard. She played like a woman trying to remember who she once was. On the 3rd night, he found her outside, staring up at the stars. The air was cold enough to hurt. She held a glass of bourbon like it was her only friend. "You ever wonder what it's all for?" she asked without turning. Clay didn't know if she was talking to him or to the ghost. "Sometimes," he said. "They all wanted something from me. Every last one. Never loved me, just loved the power. The gold. The land. Funny thing is, when you lose enough, you start hiding your heart like it's a weakness." He didn't respond. What could he say? She was a fortress with eyes. But he stood beside her anyway, quiet and steady, and she didn't send him away. By the 5th day, Clay started noticing things. Shadows that didn't belong. A rider up on the ridge, who vanished before he could be sure. Locked doors in a house where every room should have been empty. Margaret received letters delivered by hand, no postmark, no signature. Her expression each time was the same, unreadable. And then came the seventh morning. He woke before dawn. The wind howled like it carried voices. Something felt wrong. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that came before a funeral. Clay grabbed his rifle and stepped outside. The frost bit his fingers. His boots crunched through the frozen grass. Then he saw it. A trail of footprints, small, precise, leading away from the house and into the woods behind the pasture. Margaret's slippers sat at the edge of the porch like she'd walked straight out of them. No note. No sign of struggle. Just gone. Clay's gut twisted. He wasn't supposed to care. This was a transaction. A name on paper. But damn it if his hands weren't shaking as he followed that trail into the trees. The forest closed around him like a mouth. Pine needles fell like whispers. He followed the prints until they stopped, abruptly, at the edge of a ravine. Below, rocks jutted out like jagged teeth. No sign of her. Clay knelt, scanned the area. Then he saw something half buried beneath leaves. A gold locket. Still warm. His breath caught. That's when the first shot rang out. The bullet tore through the tree just inches from his head. Clay dove behind a boulder, heart pounding. Another shot. He peered out. A figure, masked, rifle in hand, stood across the clearing, using the trees for cover. It wasn't a robbery. This was a setup. He didn't wait to be picked off. He moved low, fast, zigzagging through the brush. The shooter followed, steady and silent. Clay fired once, then again, but it was like trying to hit a ghost. By the time he made it back to the house, the windows had been smashed, and Margaret's prized horse was gone from the stable. He slammed the door shut behind him, lungs burning. Then he saw it, on the parlor table. A letter addressed to him. He opened it with shaking hands. Asterisk, you were never meant to see this. I hoped you'd be gone before they came. But if you're reading this, it means they're early. And I've failed again. There's more buried beneath this land than you know. Take the hidden path west. Ride hard and don't look back. Asterisk. There was no signature. Just a pressed violet inside. Clay stared at the flower, mind racing. He'd stepped into something far deeper than a marriage of convenience. Something dangerous. Something ancient. And he was no longer just a bystander. He was a target. And Margaret Everly, wherever she was either running from death or dragging it toward him. Clay didn't sleep that night. He sat in the ruined parlor with the letter clenched in his calloused hand and his rifle across his lap. The wind screamed through the broken windows, rattling the shutters like bones. His mind replayed every word Margaret had spoken, every glance, every hesitation. She knew this would happen. She hadn't just married him for a name, she'd brought him into a war. One he hadn't seen coming. At dawn, he saddled his horse and rode west, just as the letter instructed. The path was barely visible, an old game trail snaking through the hills behind the ranch. Trees closed in thick and low, the kind that kept secret. The further he went, the quieter the world became, until even the wind stopped talking. 2 hours in, he found the old shack. It was hidden behind a curtain of moss-draped pines, its roof sagging under the weight of years. But it wasn't abandoned. The ashes in the fire pit were still warm. Clay stepped inside, gun drawn. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight. A voice cut through the stillness. Shut the door. He froze, then turned slowly. Margaret Everly sat in the far corner, wrapped in a wool blanket, a small pistol resting in her lap. Her hair was down, wild around her shoulders, and for the first time, she looked her age, drawn, pale, almost fragile. I told you to leave, she said quietly. I did, Clay answered. Then someone tried to kill me. She sighed. I had hoped they wouldn't come so soon. I was buying time. Clay stepped closer, lowering his rifle but not his guard. Who's they? She stared into the cold hearth, as if the answer lay among the ashes. Men who believe this land owes them something. Men my late husband wronged. There were things buried beneath our feet long before I came along, secrets he took to the grave. I married Claiborne to protect what remained. But that protection ended the day he died. Now they think I hold the key." "What kind of secrets?" Clay asked. She looked at him then, her gaze hollow but sharp. "There's gold under that ridge. Not the kind in veins or nugget. A vault, hidden since the war. Union payroll. Stolen, buried, lost to time. My husband was one of the men who stole it. He killed for it. So did the others." Clay absorbed the words slowly, like a man swallowing glass. "And they think you know where it is." "I don't," she said. "But I know enough to make me dangerous." Outside, a branch snapped. Instantly, both of them froze. Margaret reached for her pistol. Clay moved to the window and peered through a gap in the wall. Nothing. Then another snap. This one closer. "Pack what you need," he said. "We're leaving." She didn't argue. Within minutes, they were on horseback, riding hard through the trees. Clay led them through deer paths and dry creek beds, winding through the forest like ghosts trying not to be seen. But it wasn't enough. By late afternoon, he spotted riders behind them. 3, maybe 4, dressed in dusters, their faces hidden. No badges. No words. Just the silence of men with a purpose. Clay pushed their horses harder, guiding them toward the high cliffs beyond Bear's Hollow. If they could reach the caves, they'd have cover. But the trail was narrow and the shadows deepened fast. The sun dipped behind the peaks, throwing the world into a golden haze. At the pass, one of the horses stumbled, Margaret's. She cried out as it fell, dragging her down. Clay leapt from his saddle, pulled her free. Her ankle was twisted, her face pale with pain. "Can you ride?" he asked. No. He didn't hesitate. He lifted her into his saddle, tied the reins to his own belt, and started walking, half leading, half dragging both horses toward the ridge. Shots rang out behind them. The bark exploded from trees. Clay turned and fired blindly, forcing the pursuers to duck. Margaret clung to the saddle horn, lips pressed together against the pain. By the time they reached the caves, Clay's legs were numb and blood seeped from a graze on his arm. He guided them into the first cavern, a narrow cut of stone that opened into a natural chamber. There they stopped. Margaret slid from the horse and collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. Clay checked the entrance, listening. No sound followed. For now they were alone. He knelt beside her. "Let me see your ankle." She winced as he removed her boot. The swelling had begun. "You need rest," he said. "We don't have time." He looked at her. "Then you better start telling me everything." Margaret nodded, eyes heavy. "Claiborne didn't just steal the payroll. He made a map. Not paper, too dangerous. He carved it into something no one would think to check." "What?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "A saddle. The one I gave you on our wedding day." Clay's heart skipped. "That's why I picked you," she said. "Not because you were easy to buy. Because I saw how you handled that stallion at the auction. Gentle hands. You'd take care of the horse. You wouldn't notice the stitching until you needed to." He sat back, reeling. The saddle. It was back at the ranch. He hadn't taken it, only a spare. He hadn't even looked at the damn thing since the wedding. "If they find it first." "They won't," he said. "I'll go back." Her hand clutched his wrist. "You go back alone, you'll die. They want the map, not me. I'm bait now. They think I'll lead them to it." He looked at her, really looked. The woman who once ruled half the territory now sat wounded and hunted, her empire burning from the edges inward. But her eyes hadn't lost that steel. "You trusted me with your name," he said. "Now trust me with your life." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she gave a faint nod. They spent the night in the cave, huddled close against the cold. Clay kept watch, rifle across his knees. At first light, he led Margaret deeper into the canyon, where a friendly miner owed him a favor and could offer shelter. Then, without another word, he turned and rode out alone, heading back toward the ranch with one thought burning through his skull. He wasn't just a hired name anymore. He was the last line between the past and its reckoning. The ride back to the ranch was long and punishing. Clay didn't sleep, didn't stop, didn't breathe easy. Every creak of saddle leather and whisper of wind made him turn, expecting rifles to rise from the brush. But he pushed forward, through freezing dawns and sun-split afternoons, driven by something heavier than fear, resolve. The saddle. That damn saddle. The one he'd ignored, left propped in the barn as though it were just another piece of worn-out tack. He cursed himself a dozen times. Margaret had handed him the answer, and he'd missed it, too blinded by suspicion and pride. By the time the ranch house came into view, dusk had settled over the plains like a veil. Smoke curled from what was left of the barn, now a blackened husk. Someone had come through. Looking. Likely not finding. Yet. The front door of the house hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Clay dismounted quietly, tied the reins low, and unslung his rifle. He crept toward the barn first. The fire had gutted much of it, but the rear tack room had been spared. Inside, beneath a heap of scorched canvas, lay the saddle. His saddle. He pulled it free, brushing away soot. The tooling on the leather looked ordinary at first. But under closer inspection, there it was. A strange set of notches along the underside, carved into the fender strap. Triangular cuts, patterns almost too deliberate to beware. He pried them open carefully, revealing tiny folds, rawhide stitched over a piece of oilcloth. Inside that, a map. Not paper. Deerhide. Faded, brittle, but legible. He studied it quickly. Landmarks he recognized: Widow's Peak, Ash Valley. An X marked a spot near the old river bend, half a day's ride north. But he had no time to linger. Someone was coming. Fast. Boots crunched gravel outside the barn. Clay ducked, heart pounding. A voice called out. He's here. The saddle's gone. Clay cursed and bolted out the back, keeping low. Gunshots rang behind him, bullets tearing through the old barn wall like knives through paper. He reached his horse, kicked the stirrup, and mounted with one fluid motion. As he galloped away, he fired 2 shots behind him, not to kill, just to scatter, and vanished into the darkening hills. By midnight, he reached the river bend. It was quieter there, thick with fog. The land folded into itself, a pocket of shadow and stone forgotten by time. He followed the map's trail, counting paces, measuring slope, reading the old trees like scripture. Finally, he stopped. Beneath a crooked elm, the earth felt wrong, softer, looser. He dropped to his knees and dug. Hours passed. Hands raw. Nails cracked. The scent of earth and age filled the air. Then his fingers struck metal. A rusted lid. An old strongbox. He dragged it up, trembling. When he pried it open, the air caught in his lungs. Gold. Union bars. At least a dozen. Worth more than the land around them 10 times over. But it wasn't just the gold. There were documents too. Names. Ledgers. Everything Claiborne and his co-conspirators had hidden. Proof of what Margaret had feared. And something else. A sealed envelope. With Clay's name on it. He opened it slowly. Inside, Margaret's handwriting. Asterisk, if you're reading this, then you chose to stay. You chose more than your pride or your name. You chose me. You chose the truth. I knew you would. Asterisk. He folded it away, lips tightening. This woman had planned everything. Not just the marriage. Not just the deception. She'd known she needed someone stubborn enough to keep digging when the world told him to stop. Someone without roots, without loyalties. Someone like him. The sun rose red and mean. Clay reburied the gold. He wasn't fool enough to carry it, and took only the documents. Then he rode south, toward the mining outpost where he'd left Margaret with the old prospector. But the place was wrong. Too quiet. The cabin door stood open, and the inside had been ransacked. Blood smeared the floor. Margaret! His voice cracked the silence, but no reply came. Only the echo of his own fear. Tracks led north. Wagon wheels. Horses. A trail of broken branches. Clay followed them like a hound possessed, tearing through scrub and stone, heedless of pain. At sunset, he found her. A camp in the canyons. 4 men. A 5th tied to a tree. Margaret. Her face was bruised, her mouth gagged, but her eyes still burned. Still alive. Clay didn't hesitate. He circled wide, crawling through brush, counting rifles and waiting for the right breath of wind to cover his steps. He struck just after nightfall. A flash of fire. 1 man dropped. Another screamed. Clay moved like a ghost, rifle in hand, knife in the other. The 3rd man came at him, swinging wild. Clay ducked, drove the blade upward, and twisted. The 4th turned and ran. Clay didn't follow. He ran to Margaret, cutting her loose. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "I knew you'd come." He held her tight. "Always." Later, with the moon high and the dead cooling in silence, she asked, "What now?" Clay stared into the fire. "We can sell the documents, expose everything, or disappear. Do you want to disappear?" He looked at her, really looked. This woman who had tricked him, tested him, and somehow earned every inch of his loyalty. "Not without you." She smiled faintly. "Then let's start over. Somewhere green. With good dirt and no ghosts." Clay nodded. But as he lay there beside her, watching the flames dance, he knew the truth. The past never stayed buried. A week later, they rode into a town no one had heard of, under names no one recognized. She bought a small ranch with what little she had left after liquidating the last of her holdings. Clay rebuilt the barn with his own hands. The saddle, his saddle, he hung above the hearth, a reminder of the story that had almost cost them everything. They never spoke of the gold again. But sometimes, when the wind turned just right, he'd catch her looking east. Toward the canyon. Toward the place where her old life had burned away. And he understood. Some wounds healed slowly. Some never did. But in the quiet between storms, when the grass was tall and the horses fed gentle in the fields, they found something worth more than gold or names or even vengeance. Peace. And Clay, the poor cowboy who'd once thought he was marrying into power, had discovered something far rarer. A purpose, and a love not bought but earned. Where the past never stays buried, and redemption waits for those brave enough to seek it. The rains came late that year, drumming softly on the roof of their little ranch house like a lullaby from the sky. Clay sat on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar into something shapeless but familiar, an old habit from lonelier days. His boots were muddy, shirt damp from work, but his eyes watched the horizon, where the clouds pulled shadows across the hills. Behind him, the warmth of the hearth flickered through the windows, and Margaret's voice drifted from the kitchen as she hummed an old tune neither of them could quite remember the words to. It had been nearly 2 years since they'd vanished into the folds of the West, shedding names like snakeskin, starting over where no one cared who they'd once been. The gold remained buried where only they knew, untouched. The documents they had carried were mailed quietly to the right hands. Judges, journalists, men of principle with more power than greed. The Claiborne Empire had not collapsed overnight, but it cracked. Foundations trembled. Trials followed. Names were printed in papers. And justice, slow but steady, began to walk. Still, they lived quietly, carefully. Margaret planted roses near the barn, claiming the soil was too poor, but the blooms rose anyway. Clay built fences, fixed gates, and taught the horse to come when whistled. At night, they spoke of nothing and everything, of books, of weather, of the kinds of lives they might have lived if not for the ones they had been handed. And though they never said it aloud, both knew the peace they'd found was fragile, a bird resting on a wire, always ready to fly. The storm brought visitors. It was early morning when Clay spotted the first rider. Then 2 more. Dark coats, tall hats. The sort of men who didn't travel this far unless they were looking for something, or someone. Margaret saw them too. She stepped out onto the porch, towel still in her hand, lips drawn tight. "Trouble?" she asked, voice even. "Not yet," Clay replied, rising. "But close." They watched as the riders dismounted and approached. One of them, An older man with a steel-gray beard and a polished badge pinned low on his vest, stepped forward. His name was Warden Eli Griggs, a federal man, the kind who read old warrants like gospel and didn't smile often. Behind him, a young deputy and a tracker waited with quiet eyes. "You're Clay Whitlock?" Griggs asked, though he already knew. "I am." The marshal looked at Margaret. "And you're Margaret Claiborne?" She didn't flinch. "Not anymore." Griggs nodded. "I ain't here to dig up ghosts. But you should know, Claiborne escaped custody 2 weeks ago. Took 2 men with him. Burned a convoy outside Phoenix." Clay's heart sank. Margaret's fingers gripped the towel tighter. "You think he's coming here?" Clay asked. Griggs shrugged. "He's got nowhere else to run. Word is, he blames you two for everything. Says you betrayed family, stole what was his. He won't stop." Margaret spoke softly. "He never did." Griggs handed Clay a piece of paper. A sketch. Claiborne's face, older, meaner, but still recognizable. "We're setting up a line south of the river. You got 3 days. After that, we can't guarantee your safety." Clay didn't argue. He folded the paper, nodded once, and watched as the men rode away. Margaret didn't speak until they were gone. "We knew this could happen." "Yeah," Clay said. "But I hoped it wouldn't." That night they packed what little they needed: tools, clothes, ledgers, food. Clay dug up the strongbox just before dawn, wiping the dirt from its lid like brushing dust from old memory. They hid the gold inside the cellar beneath loose boards and straw. If they survived what was coming, they could come back for it. If not, the earth would keep it safe. The next day passed in stillness. No travelers. No signs. Just wind and the rising hum of distant thunder. On the 3rd day, the dogs began to bark. Clay stepped outside, rifle in hand. Margaret followed, no longer the delicate woman in a lace dress but something forged: fire and grit and silence. A single horse approached from the ridge. Claiborne. He looked like a man unchained from death, thinner but tall in the saddle, eyes blazing with the kind of madness born from pride too long left to fester. His coat was stained with travel and blood, and a pistol sat low on his hip, easy to reach. "Thought you'd be gone," he called out. "Thought you'd be dead," Clay replied. Claiborne laughed, and it was a hard sound. "Tried that. Didn't stick. I see you've made yourself comfortable. My father's widow playing farmer's wife. Ain't that something?" "You're not here for talk," Margaret said. "So don't waste breath." Claiborne's eyes narrowed. "You stole what was mine. The land. The legacy. The future. You buried your future the day you started killing for gold," Clay said. Claiborne dismounted slowly. "You took everything. My father's name. My inheritance. That map." Margaret stepped forward. "You mean the one your father left me because he knew what kind of monster you were becoming?" "I was his blood," Claiborne roared. "He knew," she said, voice cold. "He knew, and he chose a man who had nothing, because he saw what you'd do with power." Claiborne's hand moved toward his gun. Clay raised his rifle. Neither blinked. Then a shot. Claiborne staggered back. Not from Clay's bullet. Margaret held a smoking pistol in her hands, face pale, eyes wide but steady. Claiborne dropped to his knees, gasping. You'll hurt no one else," she whispered. He collapsed in the dirt, and the wind blew dust across the trail. Griggs arrived hours later, with the sun high and the air heavy. He took one look at the body and nodded. "Self-defense." "Yes," Clay said. Griggs looked at Margaret. "You all right?" She nodded. "I will be." They buried Claiborne beneath the ridge. No marker. No name. Just earth and silence. When the lawmen left, the ranch was theirs again. No more ghosts. No more secret. Months passed. The rains grew warmer. The roses bloomed stronger. One evening, Clay walked to the barn and found Margaret there, staring at the saddle. "Still thinking of leaving?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore." She smiled. "Then maybe we start something new. Something honest." And so they did. No gold. No legacies. Just land. And quiet. And two people who had walked through fire and chosen each other anyway. Their story didn't end with a blaze or a bullet. It ended in peace. And every now and then, when strangers passed through asking questions, Clay would nod politely and offer nothing but smiles. Because some names were best left in the dust. And some stories, once finally finished, didn't need retelling.